Hello, everyone. Welcome to Agora. This is the English podcast version of the radio show that I do weekly. I'm Gabriel Andrade, your host. My Twitter at GAndrade80. And joining me on the other end of the line is Stephen Cave. He's a philosopher and author of the book Immortality. Hi, Stephen. Welcome.
Hello, Gabriel. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, what's this book about?
It's about our quest for immortality. It's about our desire to defeat death, something I believe is inborn in each of us.
Right. And how do we attempt to defeat death?
Well, every culture in human history has some story about how it isn't what it seems, how we can somehow conquer death and keep going forever. But behind the apparent enormous diversity of different stories, I believe there are actually just four basic forms that this story can take, four basic immortality strategies.
All right. What are those four?
So the first one is the most obvious. It's just staying alive. So the dream of staying alive in these bodies on this earth forever is something that we can find in every culture in human history in the form of a story of an elixir of life or a fountain of youth, or of course nowadays we tell ourselves the story use the language of medicine and technology. We have the stem cells, engineering can keep us going forever. But of course this story isn't that convincing. The one thing that everybody has tried to find an elixir of life now has in common is that they're dead. So we need a backup plan. And exactly that kind of backup plan is what the second basic immortality story offers, and that's resurrection. So the resurrection story stays with the idea that you are this body, but it accepts that we're going to have to die and says, yeah, okay, but we can rise again. Now, this is something we see every year in nature. In winter, they die back. In spring, things are born again. And to tap into this cycle of nature, this cycle of life and death and rebirth, is what the resurrection story is trying to do. And of course, the most famous resurrection story is that of Jesus, who died, was 3 days in the tomb, and was born again. And the idea of Christianity is that if we go to Mass and say our prayers, then we'll be able to do what Jesus did.
Right.
And still
No, regarding the first answer, I mean, transhumanists say that they have a pretty good chance of achieving some sort of elixir. And there's the work of Aubrey de Grey and other scientists who are saying that they can prolong longevity long enough to being mortal. Why do you think that's not an accurate proposal?
Well, the idea that our civilization, our technology is now so advanced that we are the lucky generation who are on the verge of finding the elixir of life, this is something that was believed by the ancient Egyptians, for example, about 5,000 years ago. It was something that was believed by the ancient Chinese 2,000 years ago. Every generation in history believes it is the lucky one that is on the verge of finding this technology. Well, we are the lucky ones. We do have very advanced medicine. It's helping us to live a little bit longer. And maybe with new advances, we can live a little bit longer still. But living to 120 or 150 or even 1,000 is still a long way from immortality.
Right. What about the third and fourth answer?
So the third answer gives up on the body. It says the body is just too unreliable, it's too messy, and resurrection sounds too much like a zombie film, crawling out of the grave. It says what we want is a kind of spiritual immortality. We want to just float free from the body and live on in heaven. And that, of course, is the belief in a soul. This is the third immortality story. We find it all over the world in many religions and many cultures. And in a way, we're telling ourselves a modern version of this story too. We believe we can upload our minds onto the internet and live on as our avatars. This is the same story, just retold in the vocabulary of our day.
Right, and what's wrong with that? I mean, because I see it as a very good prospect. I mean, the idea that I have a backup copy of myself, and if, let's say, a robot is not made out of human flesh, but it keeps my memories, would that still be me? I mean, that's the way Ray Kurzweil and other great transhumanists present this prospect. How do you evaluate that?
Well, you can tell the story in a way that sounds like you're living forever. You can tell a story a bit like this. You can say every week you go to the Immortality Factory to have your mind backed up onto a computer. And if something terrible happens, like you get hit by a bus, then the Immortality Factory just makes a robot you and downloads the latest version of your mind that you uploaded just the other day. And then, the new you goes back to your wife and family and carries on doing your job. And it looks to the whole world like you survived. But we can also tell the story in a way that makes clear that this isn't real survival. Imagine it looks like you're going to get hit by a bus. And so the message gets sent to the Immortality Factory to start making the new you, but actually you survive. You manage to jump out the way just in time. And you don't know anything about the fact that the Immortality Factory has made a you version 2 until you get home and see it, there sitting down with your wife and family, and you wrestle with each other, you argue about who gets your clothes and who gets to live in your house and who gets your job. It would be very clear in that case that the second you is not actually you. And so if I then came along and said, look, there's no room for both of you, I'm afraid I'm going to have to kill one, then I would say, hey, not me, kill the new one. You would see going on as this second you as being as good as actual survival.
Right, but philosopher Robert Nozick had this theory of the closest continuer, and he said, well, but if there is a rival, then in that case, the new you is not really you. I mean, the copy can be you as long as there is no rival. How do you see that continued theory from Robert Nozick?
I think Robert Nozick's theory is a good way of describing how we want to talk about it. So if there's a replica of you, but you still exist, then we would say the replica is just a replica. If you don't still exist, then we might say, well, actually, the replica can be you. Let's call the replica real. That's all fine for how we talk about it, but I don't think it's a very good description of how from the inside. Like I say, I think if I said, look, we're going to have to kill you so your replica can live on, then you wouldn't be very happy about that.
Right. Well, what about the fourth narrative of how we can be immortal?
So all of the three main stories, just living on and resurrection and living on as a soul, have real profound philosophical problems. But there is another way, which is just as popular, and that's living on through some kind of legacy. So through the echo we leave in the world, and this could be a biological legacy, it could be our children passing on our genes, or living on as part of our family or tribe, or it can be living on through some kind of cultural legacy.
Right, but I remember Woody Allen saying, I don't want to live in the hearts of my countrymen, I want to live in my apartment. Would that be real immortality?
Well, I think we're right to be skeptical. Lots of people have sacrificed everything, even their lives, for fame, for glory. Think of Achilles. There he was on the battlefield in front of Troy, and he knew, because it had been prophesied by his mum, who was a goddess, he knew that if he stayed and fought at Troy, he would die, but he would win eternal glory. Whereas if he went home, he could live a long and happy life. And he chose to stay and to fight. And of course, here we are talking about him 3,000 years later, even though he was dead. So he got what he wanted. But what good has it done him? Is he less dead because we're talking about him? Well, no, I don't think so.
Right. Is your book pessimistic?
I don't think it is pessimistic, although I changed my own views as I was writing it. Now, when I started writing it, I could see that there were these 4 immortality stories, and I was quite open-minded about which one of them might lead to the truth. It was like 4 doors in front of me now, opening each one in turn, thinking maybe behind this door is the prize. I opened the first one, no, I don't think it's there. Tried the second one, all the way through. But by the time I opened the 4th door, legacy, and realized that also wasn't immortality, then I'd come to see the quest for immortality differently. I don't think that optimistic means hoping we can live forever. I don't think living forever ought to be our goal. And through researching the book, I found a different tradition that I call in the book the wisdom tradition, which is a name I take from the wisdom books of the Bible, which can be found in the Old Testament. And they come from a period in history in the Middle East where people very much associated wisdom with accepting mortality. It's about recognizing that immortality is a kind of fantasy, and accepting that we're going to die is something that leads us to appreciate the time that we have.
But isn't that some sort of a conservative resignation, in the sense that, some centuries ago, the average lifespan was probably 40 years old, and here we are, right now it's 80 years old. Why stop here? Why not continue on until 120, 160, 200?
Look, I love life, and I want to for a long time. I go running, I try to stay fit, and I'm all for research that tries to defeat aging and defeat disease and give us long and healthy lives. I think that's great. But even if we're living to 1,000, we are still mortal. And my worry is that by talking about immortality, by talking about technology giving us indefinitely long lives, then we fail to appreciate the time we've got. It's like we sit here thinking, I don't need to worry about the fact that my time is limited. There are scientists in white coats in labs who are sorting this whole thing out for me. It's only by accepting that our time is limited that we realize that it is precious. And no matter how long we live, our time is still limited.
Okay, we're almost finishing, but I want to point this question too. You say that in those four narratives, they all have their potential dangers. I mean, the first one, there's the danger of overpopulation. You mentioned that in the book. In the second one, well, there's the idea of martyrdom. I mean, if you think that resurrection is waiting for you and 72 virgins and so on, it's easier to crash airplanes into buildings. As for the idea of immortality of the soul, well, that's also dangerous because you forget about things from the body and also the concerns of daily life. And in the fourth one, you also say that by attempting to be immortal, like Achilles, well, you can commit a lot of atrocities. Now, which one of the four would you say is the most dangerous of all?
That's a good question. I think it's in the name of legacy that the damage has been done. And the best example of this, I think, is Alexander the Great. You know, this is a hero of our culture. This is someone people have tried to emulate. He's held up to children as an example we ought to follow. This is someone who killed somewhere in the region of 1 million people.
Wow.
He enslaved whole populations, he destroyed whole cultures, whole civilizations, he killed priests, he had women raped, children killed. This was a man so bad on such a big scale, you know, that someone once said, if you kill one man, it's murder. If you kill a million, then you know you're a politician, and if you kill them all, then you're a god. It's like he killed so many people that he just transcended normal human terms. If he'd killed just a few, we'd have locked him up, but he didn't. He killed 1 million, and so we call him the Great.
Right. Well, one final thing that I wanted to point out about your book that I really, really enjoy was the supreme irony of Erostratus. I mean, he burns the temple of Ephesus, attempting immortality, and apparently he achieves it. But what really gets my attention is that the city council, in order to prevent other people from doing that, attempt to erase his memory, and yet here we are speaking about him. Now, how can we avoid these ironies in the future? Do you have any recommendation?
Well, you know, so I think we should introduce the idea of the herostratic crime. So this is an idea named after Herostratus, this guy who burnt down this amazing temple, one of the 7 wonders of the world, and he did it just to become famous. It was because he realized he had no special talents. He wasn't particularly clever, he wasn't strong, he wasn't a great warrior, he wasn't a great artist. He realized the only way he could ever be famous was by doing something terrible. And of course, people do those kinds of things today, you know, high school shootings or shooting someone famous, John Lennon or whatever. And we need to treat these people as the kind of narcissists that we are. It's very difficult these days to stop global media coverage. It's difficult to stop someone becoming famous. But we can at least point at them and say, this is someone so narcissistic. They did something terrible just.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Agora. This is the English podcast version of the radio show that I do weekly. I'm Gabriel Andrade, your host. My Twitter @GAndrade80. And joining me on the other end of the line is Stephen Cave.